The Laughing Cavalier here, presenting to you another tale of these troubled times. Today, I shall be doing a video I really didn't want to do, but since history is my passion, I feel obliged to make it. I did want to do one about the historical accuracy in English Civil War related movies, but there aren't many. We have Cromwell, which I've already reviewed, To Kill a King, and a few TV series like The By the Sword Divided, The Devil's... that word that'll give me a community guideline strike, and some other adaptations of The Children of the New Forest. That's it, really. The Tudors, on the other hand, are probably the most famous dynasty in English history, and have been portrayed numerous times. Out of all the Tudor monarchs, the two most popular amongst filmmakers are Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, in that order. We've had some pretty decent portrayals of bluff King Hal over the years, Keith Michel's being the best in my humble opinion. However, in recent years we've had some productions that seem to care not for accuracy. Of note, of course, is the series The Tudors, which I shall be focusing on in the first part of this video. Now, I must admit it's been many years since I've sat down and watched the series, and since I don't want to pay for a series I hate... Yo ho, a pirate's life for me! Also, since I don't particularly fancy rewatching the entire 4 seasons of this show, I decided to limit my examination of this series to one of Henry's wives, Katherine Howard. Firstly, she's probably the least written about of Henry's wives, owing to her short reign and minimal impact on history, compared to Henry's other wives, like Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn. And secondly, she's only around for half a season, so that's less to watch. Portrayals of Catherine on screen have varied over the years. Up until the 60s, she was portrayed as a tragic Juliet figure, doomed due to an illegal love affair. Then in the 60s, the historian Lacey Baldwin-Smith wrote a rather damning history of her life that portrayed her as a selfish, frivolous teenager, which has lasted in various ways to the present, and this approach to her life is apparent in the Tudors. However, in recent years, historians have started to reappraise the evidence surrounding her life and are coming to different conclusions, namely that she was actually rather kind during her brief reign, and undertook her duties as queen rather diligently. Most notably, she got pardons for men such as Sir Thomas Wyatt, and even sent clothing to Margaret Paul, Countess of Salisbury, probably against the wishes of her husband, who had the Countess beheaded not long after. Her downfall will come about due to 2 things. Firstly, an alleged love affair with Frances Derham before she married Henry, and secondly, an affair with the courtier Thomas Culpeper during her reign as queen. Historians now seem to be re-evaluating these affairs, and I am personally planning to do a video discussing her guilt. Briefly, it seems more likely that the affair with Derham was more of a case of him forcing himself onto Katherine, who was probably on about 13 or 14 at the time, and the alleged affair with Culpeper probably never really happened the way people think. More likely than not, Culpeper planned to have a romance with the Queen, but didn't succeed. His confession, though, that "I meant to do ill with the Queen and she likewise," in spite of Katherine stating otherwise, was enough evidence to have both of them sent to the block. With this backstory of the actual history out of the way, I will now address my main problems the way Katherine and her husband Henry VIII are portrayed in the Tudors. As mentioned, I will mainly stick to the first half of the 4th season, but in the case of Henry I may refer to the earlier episodes. The first major problem I would highlight with the Tudors is casting, and the makers of the show decided to cast Tamsin Merchant in the role. Now, I'm sure she is a nice person, and she can act well, but honestly she just doesn't feel right for the role. When I see a film in a historical setting, I like to be immersed. I generally find that the ones that cast actors who look, sound and, well, act like the person they are portraying to be the better productions. For example, Alec Guinness drove for authenticity in his portrayal of Charles I in the film Cromwell, giving him a slight Scottish accent and a stutter, which, added with the makeup and his brilliant performance, gives us the best portrayal of the king on screen, in spite of the numerous historical inaccuracies in that film. Now, whilst we don't have as much information on Katherine, we can make some assumptions based on the evidence that we have. This Holbein portrait is most likely to be of her, and we can tell that she had light brown hair. Other portraits that are proposed to be of her also tend to show this reddish-brown hair. Contemporary accounts also mention she was very young, probably somewhere between 15 and 17 when she arrived at court, and that she was actually quite charitable as queen and sought pardons for quite a few people, as previously mentioned. Not only that, but she did try to mend relations between Henry and his daughters, being particularly fond of Elizabeth. She was certainly new to court and did not have the experience of her predecessors, nor she was as important by any means, but there is definitely a story to be told. We don't get this with Merchant, though. She has blonde hair, first off, which, okay, yes, that is pedantic, but you couldn't find an actress with the right hair colour? Hair aside, though, the way she acts in the series is just out of character for somebody of the times.
Your Majesty?
Lady Mary, I have come here in person to ask you why you will not show me the respect which, as Queen of England, I am entitled to expect even from you. I noticed, as did everyone else, that you show the greatest respect to the Lady Anne of Cleves, even though she is now just a private person and worth no account.
Forgive me, but surely the Lady Anne is worthy of every respect. She carries herself with great dignity, and also modesty.
And finally, as I briefly mentioned, the way she is shown on screen bears only a limited resemblance to what we know about her. Instead of a young girl, kind-hearted and forced into her position by her powerful uncle, We get a portrayal of her as a dumb blonde who spends half the show skipping around a room tantalising half the men in the court, and the other half as a giggling schoolgirl who has just been made the prom queen. This was all very deliberate.
The thing is, what I actually wanted to make sure is that Katherine seemed like quite a modern young woman and not... I think with period drama, it's quite easy to play to the period and play as a sort of Tudor 1500s era person, but I think with Catherine Howard, what I actually wanted to highlight is the fact that she doesn't really fit into court and she doesn't really kind of conform to the propriety that's expected of her.
The problem with that, though, is that just about every other character feels like they are in the modern day and not the 16th century. I mean, just look at Jonathan Rhys-Meyers as Henry VIII. If properly dressed and given the right makeup, he could have looked a bit like Henry VIII when he was younger, but by season 4 of the show he is barely aged, whereas the real Henry was morbidly obese and suffering from leg ulcers, which does not help his already paranoid mind. I mean, when you see these two, can you honestly picture them as the historical characters? Compare the Tudors to how Catherine Howard is portrayed in the film Henry VIII and His Six Wives. In that film, she was portrayed by Lynn Frederick, who was absolutely perfect in the role. Firstly, she was 17 at the time of filming, the perfect age for Catherine, as opposed to Merchant, who was in her early 20s. Secondly, despite the fact she only had about 15 minutes of screen time, if that, we get a lot of hints about her character. For example, this scene.
Your Grace.
Do you have him?
Have I Your Grace's permission?
Bring him in, Lady Rochford.
Hmm?
Begin now.
Oh, not another one.
Oh, it's delightful.
Yes, but you have 3 already.
He's for the Lady Anne.
Of Cleves?
Ah, yes.
Oh, the settlements I've had to make on that woman. The manors, the estates, and now a spaniel.
Oh, I'd so like to have the little dog. May I give it to her? Please.
Oh, it's a dear little thing. She can have it.
This is so kind.
Then there is this scene where we see just how she was put in this position in the first place.
A young wilding to whip the stale blood and lead him back to Rome. But how to do it, Emmeline?
I believe if the matter were put to the clergy at convocation, that His Grace wedded against his will.
And that it would prevent a threatened invasion. No, she'd never agree to a divorce.
Who knows? If the terms were made sufficiently attractive, she might even become the king's adopted sister.
You are greatly honored, niece.
I had not looked for it, sir. I had
Mistress, you may no longer consider your own wishes. You now have a duty to return England to the true faith.
Just from this one scene, you can see that she's being heavily influenced by her uncle and his faction. I mean, he's literally grabbing her arm as they walk off. One thing I also love about this particular film is they went to great lengths to try and get the sets and costumes right. Catherine is wearing what they call a French hood in most of her scenes, which matches the Holbein portrait and contemporary accounts who mention that she dressed in the latest French fashion. In the earlier TV series that they based the film version off of, they went out of their way to find Tudor-era portraits as a reference and, despite the low budget of that series, did a good job showing what the people of the Tudor court dressed like. Do we get this in the Tudors? No. Very little attention was given to accuracy, and the attitude was taken that, we'll just make something that we like the look of. I mean, that is a rather dangerous attitude to take when you were making a drama based off of historical events. It leads to things like, Henry VIII and his... No amount of therapy is going to get that image out of my mind. As for scenery, the Tudors also fails on many levels. I can be a bit more forgiving of this since many of the palaces that Henry was at have long since been demolished. Even a large part of the original palace at Hampton Court was knocked down in the 17th century. The most accurate Tudor dramas have struggled with this as well. The TV series had a few rickety sets to work with, whilst the film did go on location. Whilst most of the sets look better, a few like the Council Chamber one look a bit off compared to the wood panelling you normally see in Hampton Court and other places. Still, one thing I cannot forgive is the yet again lazy attitude to scenery that this Tudors series had. For example, Katherine is brought to the Tower to wait her execution, which is accurate, although for some reason she is locked in some dark dungeon, which is not true. She was housed in the Queen's apartment since, while she had had her title taken away from her, she was still a lady of noble birth, and was treated as such. Her execution does not take place, though, inside the walls of the Tower, as historically happened, but in some random town square. Why did this happen? Well, the makers of the film had this to say.
Normally, we stage our executions within the walls of the Tower of London, but in her case, we've moved it to a town square. There'll be a much bigger and more varied crowd. You kind of stand in for the audience. I want to show a sense of collective bewilderment and even horror that such a young girl could be executed by the king at his whim. Well, first off, most executions you have shown prior to this did not actually happen inside the walls of the Tower, as happened with Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn. People like George Boleyn, William Norris, etc. were executed on Tower Hill, outside the Tower, so you wrote yourself into that position. Secondly, what? The crowd doesn't even look that big in the scene. If anything, it is smaller than the one for Anne Boleyn's. Not to mention that, even if you wanted to show people being horrified at what was happening, moving the execution from the tower to a town square does nothing to change that. You can have people react the exact same way inside the tower, and there were some people like the merchant Otwell Johnson present who, whilst probably a local official, I would hardly call a nobleman. It would be like if I made a film about the Titanic and, when it got to Captain Smith's death scene, I went, well, I want to see more people horrified at what is going on, so I will have the captain die on the Hindenburg instead. That'll make it different.
For all my criticisms, though, there clearly was someone writing this series who had some knowledge of the events and did try to present the facts. For example, they include Catherine's desire the night before her execution to have the block brought to her so that she could make trial of it, which was reported by Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador. The Tudors, though, managed to mess this up, though, by having her stark naked whilst rehearsing her death. I don't understand. Why? Were you making a historical drama or a striptease show? I may be a bit of a puritan when it comes to nudity in films, but if it is there for a reason and doesn't slow down the whole story, then I have no problem. But what purpose does this serve? It just makes Katherine look like a harlot for no reason. I think David Starkey summed up the Tudors and my own thoughts on the series the best. The Tudors is terrible history with no point. It's wrong for no purpose. I've got no problem with getting history wrong for a purpose. Shakespeare often got things wrong for a reason. But it's the randomised arrogance of ignorance of the Tudors. It might seem odd that a historian says that it's alright to get things wrong if there is a purpose, but I think I understand what Starkey is saying here. To give you an example, in the film Cromwell, Charles I is shown seeing his children one last time before he's executed. This scene did happen, but it was the day before his death. However, the film is only 2 hours long, so a deliberate mistake is made, i.e. Charles seeing his children on the day of his execution, in order to make a more concise film. This can also be true if we have a lack of evidence. The reasons for Anne Boleyn's downfall are, to this day, heavily debated. Some say that the primary reason was Henry's desire to get rid of Anne, others that it was more his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, convincing the king that he needed to get rid of her. This is why you get the TV series, showing Henry VIII being the driving force behind her downfall, whilst the film version seems to put more emphasis on Cromwell. As long as it is portrayed as in a believable fashion, then an event that may not have happened can be tolerated for want of a better word. The Tudors can do this in some scenes and has one advantage that has over 4 seasons, so the characters were given an appropriate amount of screen time. Anne Boleyn's presence in 2 seasons, whilst Catherine Howard is only in half of season 4, which is good, considering the fact that Anne was a far more important figure on the bearing of English history. However, its lazy approach to the events, characters and settings makes this a terrible series if you want to get an authentic portrayal of this pivotal period in English history. And sadly, it set the trend for bad historical dramas. Now, if you thought the Tudors was bad enough, wait till you see Reigns. Actually, scratch that, don't see Reigns. I cannot think of any other show based off of history that just doesn't care. I mean, look at the comments from the people involved with it. Anna Popplewell, who plays Lola, said that it's about exploring these wild characters in hypothetical situations. We've kind of created a new world. It's fantasy history. Adelaide Kane, who plays Mary Queen of Scots, had this to say: how many teenage girls do you know who are obsessed with history? I know I wasn't at that age. You see, she wasn't interested in history when she was a teenager, so therefore that makes it fine to completely murder the life of a quite interesting monarch, because, girls aren't into history at all. The best comment there has to be from executive producer Laurie McCarthy. I think each episode will educate people on what element of history helps our story, and I think there's a certain amount of latitude in terms of dramatising events. I have never heard the word latitude used to describe lazily approaching history. Well done, Laurie. Wait a minute. Haven't I seen you somewhere before? Now, at this point, you're probably going, oh, come on, Cavalier, nothing can ever be perfect. How bad can this series be? Well... I can forgive small inaccuracies like some costume errors, locations not looking quite right, etc., but you could at least tried. I mean, the real-life Mary Queen of Scots inherited the throne as a 2-week-old baby, had to flee her country when she was 5 due to an English invasion, grew up in France, was widowed when she was 16, returned to Scotland in the midst of a major upheaval between Catholics and Protestants, was implicated in all sorts of scandals, was deposed from the throne, lost a civil war, imprisoned in England for 17 years, and finally lost her head due to a plot to overthrow her cousin Queen Elizabeth I. Could you really not make something out of that instead of creating a fantasy version of Keeping Up with the Kardashians blended with Game of Thrones? Not to mention the names of the supporting characters really bug me. I mean, Lola, Greer, Kenner. Could you have at least given the characters names that were more common back then, like Elizabeth, Jane, Katherine, etc., instead of making them sound like cheerleaders at a high school? What I don't understand with this Reign series is what on earth the point of it all was. Why did you need to take the names of historical characters, throw away any resemblance to historical fact, and craft a terrible fantasy story? I could somewhat forgive it if it was a decent fantasy, but it couldn't even pull that off. It's not like historical-based fantasies are impossible to do well. Now, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, so if, like me, you think anime is a nefarious plot by the Japanese to take over the world, then please skip to the next minute or two. There is a series called Girls and Panzer, in which a bunch of 15 to 18-year-old high school girls drive World War II tanks in matches against other schools that are stereotypes of the combatants of World War II. Despite the fact that they use live ammunition, it's perfectly safe though. Yukari explains it. See? Absolutely flawless, no problem at all with that explanation. You would have thought this series that had such a ridiculous premise would be terrible, but it isn't. Calling it historical fantasy might be a stretch, but it does include its historical elements, namely World War II tanks and various references to battle, while also having characters that are somewhat decently written and entertaining for the most part. It went full out with one of the most bizarre premises, yet it works. Compare this to Reigns, where they just hijack a few historical names and give us a very generic plot, with elements of a girls' high school drama being emphasised as opposed to the interesting conflicts between states and faiths that was going on during this era. That would have been much more entertaining. Of course, I'm not saying that Tudor-related drama need to go full on Girls of Panzer, although an anime where Henry VIII is a cyborg with a flamethrower for an arm would be amazing. Now, of course, dramas about Mary Queen of Scots have taken liberties in the past, that is true. The 1971 film, with Vanessa Redgrave and Glenda Jackson, had fictional scenes such as the two queens meeting, which never happened, among other inaccuracies. However, it at least vaguely tried to resemble the history of Mary Queen of Scots, and the casting was decent, with some pretty good actors. Glenda Jackson as Elizabeth was particularly good. I do recommend you watch the series Elizabeth R, made a year before the Mary Queen of Scots film, where she was absolutely perfect in the role of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, I don't want to be rude, but it seems like productions today just don't care when it comes to casting. Going back to the Tudors for a moment, Tamsin Merchant in an interview explained how she got the role.
I put myself on tape, and apparently that was enough. I mean, I put myself on tape. I was on holiday, actually, with my sister in New York at the time, put myself on tape, and they called me a couple of weeks later and said they wanted me to go to Dublin to shoot it.
No offence to her, but did they really cast her based off of one tape? Have the makers of that series never heard of auditions? I fear something similar probably happened with this Reigns. How does the future look for Tudor dramas? Well, in all honesty, not too good. As of November 2018, we have two of note that are about to come out. One a TV series based on the life of Katherine of Aragon called The Spanish Princess, and a film about Mary Queen of Scots. Having looked at the material related to these two productions, I think I can be confident saying that they're going to be pretty terrible on the accuracy front at the very least. With The Spanish Princess, I admit that I've not watched the previous two series, The White Queen and The White Princess, based off of the lives of Elizabeth Woodville and Elizabeth of York respectively, nor have I read the books by Philippa Gregory that the series is based off of. I did see The Other Boleyn Girl some years ago, and remember that production had some problems with accuracy, although compared to Reigns it was like a documentary. Nevertheless, I do have some worries about the Spanish Princess series. Now, I've not seen Charlotte Hope in anything really, so I cannot comment on her acting skills, but at least she appears to have lighter hair, which makes a nice change, since I don't think I've seen the Katherine of Aragon portrayed with the correct hair colour since 1972. Georgie Henley as Princess Margaret seems a decent enough choice, and she was pretty good in the Narnia films from what I remember, although I noticed there's no mention of her sister, Mary Tudor, which is a shame since her story could have been an interesting one to include. I don't know about the choice for Henry VIII though. Rory O'Connor, to my eyes, does not really convey the image of the king, although since I believe the series will focus more on the early years, he might just pass. Philip Cumbers though as Wolsey just doesn't look right. Hell, Sam Neill in the Tudors at least looked sort of okay for the part, and acted well from what I can remember. Cumbers is quite thin compared to all the portraits we have of Wolsey, even when he was younger. However, since of course I've not seen the series, he may well put in a good performance. Going over to the Mary Queen of Scots movie, some of the casting choices make more sense. Well, some of them. Saoirse Ronan does look quite a decent choice for Mary, although there is one noticeable problem.
I will not be scolded by my inferior.
You may notice she's speaking with a very thick Scottish accent, when in real life she'd grown up in France and probably didn't speak English very much. Now, for the sake of presenting the film, I don't mind her speaking English throughout it, but it would have been a nice little nod to history to have her speaking with a French accent. It is all the more bewildering that she is speaking with a Scottish accent, since Ronan isn't Scottish in the first place. Margot Robbie seems a bit of an odd choice for Elizabeth. She's quite pretty in comparison to the real Elizabeth, although it looks like they're going to age her extensively, which is good. It might be I'm too attached to Elizabeth R to accept anyone else other than Glenda Jackson playing Elizabeth, but Robbie hasn't really done these sort of royal roles before from what I've seen. Then there is costume and scenery. With the Spanish Princess, at least, it is better than rain, I suppose. Somerset Live released some pictures from the filming of the series at Wells Cathedral, and you can see some vague effort was made at least. The gentlemen do appear to be wearing hats, and the ladies are all wearing hoods from the looks of things. I'm not an expert on Tudor fashion by any stretch of the imagination, not to mention I'm more used to the French and English hoods of the middle to later part of Henry VIII's reign rather than the early designs, but something does feel a little off. I think it might be the sleeves on the ladies' dresses don't look quite as fancy as I'd imagine they would be in this era. Not to mention the headdresses, since the English hood was certainly in use at the time, yet we can't really see it in these pictures. Also, I would have thought the soldiers who are on duty for what I believe is meant to be the wedding of Prince Arthur and Katherine of Aragon would look a little more fancy rather than being equipped like they're about to go into battle. I do like that they have included the Tudor rose, the flag of Aragon, and the pomegranate of the Granada, all symbols used in this era. I'm less confident about the Mary Queen of Scots movie. Everybody seems to be wearing either grey, blue or black, which, in a very elegant era of fine clothes, music and lavish feast, doesn't seem quite right. This screenshot here caught my eye. Notice how only one of these gentlemen behind Mary is wearing a hat. It would be near scandalous in those times to be caught without a hat on, particularly in the presence of your monarch, since if they passed you by, then you'd not be able to doff your hat and salute. Not to mention the practicality of having a hat on outside. I would have thought as well that they would want to be wearing cloaks and proper cavalry boots if they're going for a long ride. It would also appear that this film is going to have a lot of scenes filmed inside various cathedrals, which is something that does bug me about Tudor dramas. Okay, if there is a scene that would have taken place in the cathedral, like a wedding or a coronation, that is fine. But monarchs tend to live in things called palaces, and most of the famous ones in this era tend to have wooden panelled walls and luxurious fittings, not drafty, very lofty ceilings and huge pillars. I think the two major things these modern productions are lacking are authenticity and passion. Films like Anne of the 1,000 Days, for example, have quite a few errors, not least Henry VIII visiting Anne Boleyn in the Tower, but they put a lot of effort into the sets, the soundtrack and the costumes, so the audience could at least believe it was set in the Tudor era. Not to mention you had some pretty decent actors who could convincingly play these legendary figures from history. A Man for All Seasons got this perfectly. Just look at this scene from the film where Henry VIII is going to visit Sir Thomas More. The soundtrack feels like it could be from the Tudor era, whilst a lot of effort went into the boats and the costumes to make it look authentic. Then a bit later, Henry, played by Robert Shaw here, has this moment. In just that short clip, you have established that the court is absolutely petrified of the king and has no idea what he's going to do, whilst at the same time you show Henry VIII as king who could laugh and make merry, so to speak. Modern productions make you feel like you're watching some guy speaking some lines rather than an actor becoming the role. Keith Michelle and Glenda Jackson were perfect casting choices for the time and really took on the role of these monarchs. Just watch the scene from Henry VIII and the Six Wives where Henry is dealing with the Pilgrimage of Grace, a rebellion against his dissolution of the monasteries and other policies.
These creatures. Don't we know after 28 years how to govern our kingdom? Oh, get up, get off your knees. Norfolk, this is your doing.
Your Grace.
If you had fortified the River Don as I required of you.
Your Grace, there are 30,000.
I have never yet read that a prince's council should be appointed by rude and ignorant common people. Have you, my lords?
We not 1/3 their number, sir, and much disloyalty among our men.
Christ in heaven, must I do everything? Work for you, think for you, keep you in wealth and state, and now must I teach you how to quell insurrection? You will maintain this truce until such time as you have greater levy, and then destroy these lewd subjects who have dared raise arms against the sovereign. Reduce this land to its due civility.
Grace has already promised them pardon.
Promised, Bishop, that is all.
But, sir...
Will you gainsay me?
No, Your Grace.
Will any man speak up? Spit it out!
You really feel just how afraid his court is of him by this stage, and get a good impression of his mental state, not least because of much of what he said here is directly taken from letters he wrote to the Duke of Norfolk. My closing thoughts. The older Tudor-related dramas were not perfect, of course. You're going to have to look to ones like Anne of the Thousand Days, and even The Six Wives of Henry VIII have some major issues. More on that when I get round to reviewing the rest of the series. But it feels like the makers of those films tried to represent the era, its people, and its appearance as best they could. We are now in an era where writers and directors of Tudor-related films and dramas have given up on authenticity and ditched it in favour of presenting generic storylines that bear only the slightest resemblance to historical fact. It feels like they lack passion and don't want to take risks with their productions, which I think is a great tragedy. Still, who knows? Maybe one day we might get another good series with Henry VIII. Thank you for listening. This has been The Laughing Cavalier, wishing you a good day. What a lovely day. I think I'll just check the news. Hey, wait, what's this? I knew it. It all makes sense. Germany was an ally of the Japanese. That explains the whole thing. Miho. I should have known she was behind all this.